Today we're going to be talking about how to make plans for growing food in a garden. Today we'll primarily focus on fall garden planning so that you can plan your garden during the hot summer months, but we will also talk a little bit about what can grow right now as well. If you have a moment, go ahead and introduce yourself to us in the comments. We would love to know your name, what kind of gardening you're doing right now, or if you're new to gardening, so that we can get to know you a little bit better. At any time throughout this webinar, please feel free to use the comment bar to ask questions, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as we're able to during the webinar today. Just a quick housekeeping point, all of the handouts that we'll be using today from Tarrant Area Food Bank will be listed here at this address. So if you're online with us right now and you would like to type that in, you'll be able to actually look at the handouts that we're using in today's webinar as we do this. And you can download them later if you would like to do that as well. So before we get started with making a garden plan, we need a few very basic supplies. If you don't have graph paper on hand, this is what I like to use because there are already squares, makes it easy to draw straight lines. If you just have a piece of blank paper, or if you prefer to draw out designs on your computer, any of those options are fine as well. I always like to have some sort of straight edge on hand. Helps when you're drawing straight lines, of course, but this is just for you. You can get as creative with this as you would like to. Feel free to draw pictures as we get down to our planning stage. You can use, just write out the words of the different crops. Sometimes people will even decide to use stickers of plants. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to keep this creative, but this is really all you need. This is a good project for indoors. You can do this in the hot part of the summer. You can do this in the coldest part of the winter. So before we decide what to plant and how to design our garden, we need to keep in mind what plants need to be able to grow well. Of course, plants need light, they need water, they're going to need air and soil, and they also need the gardener's attention. So we're going to think through all of those different factors in detail as we go through this webinar. The other thing we need to consider when we're deciding how to plan our garden is our needs as a gardener. How much time do we have? How much space do we have? Where are we gardening? What's realistic for us? How much attention do we really want to put into this? So keep those things in mind as we go through this process, and that will make sure that you have a successful garden. So now that we're ready, we have our materials, we're going to start talking about what to plant. We want to think through what we want to grow in our food garden. So the very first thing that's important to do is think through the vegetables and the fruits that you and your family actually enjoy eating. We don't want to plant something that we'll never eat unless we have plans to share that with a local food pantry or a food bank or some of our neighbors in need. So if you're planning to do that, then plan for those needs. If you're planning for your own family, go ahead and make a list now of some of your favorite foods. So when I'm planning for my family, I would make a list like broccoli. I would make radishes because we love radishes. I would put on there some carrots. And of course, we have to have collards from our garden at home because we love those. So we can add to our list later, but go ahead and start your basic list for your family now. You'll notice that I have listed only cool season crops because I know that's what we're talking about today, but you might have a list that includes some things that you can plant in the spring and summer and some that you can plant in the fall. So now it's time to take a look at that full list that you've made. If you haven't had time to finish your list, don't worry, you can always finish it later. We can go ahead and take a look at some of our handouts to give us guidance about what crops can grow in the warm season and which can grow in the cool season. So when you're thinking about warm season, cool season, usually what we're thinking about there is cool season crops grow from September to April. and warm season crops are usually grown from March to November. So that gives us a little bit of guidance. Now, of course, I'm speaking about our Tarrant County area. So what we're talking about is cold hardiness zone 8B, or if you're looking at Texas regions, that's region 3. That's going to help you to identify which crops to plant as well. If you have your handouts pulled up now, or if you look at them later, we have a really abbreviated list for you of cool season and warm season crops. And you can just pull that up, take a look at it, go ahead and select from that list which of your crops can actually grow in cool season. Now, there may be some things that you want to grow like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, that are typically warm season crops is how we think of those. But it is okay in Texas. We have such a lovely fall that you can actually grow those in the fall if you're interested in doing that. We'll just talk about how to do that a little bit later on. We can use transplants to make sure that we get a head start on that fall growing season. So go ahead and put in the comment section now what you're hoping to grow. We would love to know what you're hoping to grow in your fall garden. Once you have a list of the plants that you want to grow in your fall garden, we can go ahead and start thinking about when to plant those. Now, a planting calendar is usually the most helpful way to get started with that process. There are a number of resources available. We have a planting guide included for you at this address in our handouts. And this planting guide is year-long. It will show you the full calendar, and this just gives you some very open ranges that will let you know what to plant when. Take a look at this calendar, and that will help you to know what months you can actually plant your crops. Now, if you like to have more specific dates, you can also access Texas AgriLife Extension's Fall Vegetable Gardening Guide. This is a very helpful resource. And inside that resource, it will actually have a planting calendar for you that will give you the dates for our region. So we're looking at region 3, and that's a very helpful tool so you know exactly when to plant each crop. Another way that you can do this, if all you have is a package of seeds handy, and you're trying to figure out if you can plant it or not, it will have instructions on the back about when you can plant in different regions. It will also tell you on the front how many days it takes until harvest, and that will give you if you will be able to reach the maturity of the plant within the cool season period or within the warm season period. So a few tools to help you know when to start planting. We like to know not only when to plant, but we also like to know where to plant. So we want to think about, again, the plant needs. So we want to think about how much light the plants require. We want to make sure that they are getting all of the. Now you can grow indoors with lighting that mimics sunlight if you wish to do that. There are a few things you can actually grow in a windowsill. Today we're primarily talking about outdoor gardening. So we want to think about full sun. If you see a full sun, that's referring to about 6 to 8 hours of light, of bright light. If you see something that says partial shade, or you can get away with 4 to 6. So for those partial shade crops, that's going to be anything that's producing for leaves. So your lettuces, collard greens, your kale, those can all take partial shade. Now, sometimes beets and carrots and radishes are also on that partial shade list. They do fairly well planted at the base of a tomato. So they can get a little bit of dappled shade. Usually for root crops and anything that's grown for fruits. However, I really do like to see more like 6 to 8 hour range. And that we're getting the best harvest possible. Now we also want to think about water access. It's very important that a garden be situated near readily accessible water. If you put your garden far enough away from your home where you can't reach it with a water hose, you may have good intentions of carrying water out with a watering can, but that's not as likely if it's way, way away from your door as it would be if it's on your porch. So if you know that you will be using a watering can or bringing water out from your kitchen, please do plan to grow on your patio in containers, and that will help you make sure that you can keep your plants alive throughout Texas weather and any weather for that matter. So we've talked about partial shade, we've talked about sun, we've talked about water needs. It's also important for us to consider whether we're going to be growing in a container or if we're going to be growing in the ground. Different plants have different abilities to grow well in containers or in ground-based gardens. If you do plan to grow in a container, you can grow something even like an eggplant or a tomato or a pepper in a container as long as the container is large enough. You can grow lettuce, spinach, herbs. These are all cool season crops, radishes, that do very well in containers. So if you're planning to put that on your porch, plan that way. We do have a class coming up next week on container gardening, and we'll talk more in detail about how to grow in a container in that course. Now, for our drawing out our garden plan, if you plan to do a large garden or even a small garden in your yard, you can go ahead and grid that off so that you have an idea of what you're planting where. This helps you keep track from season to season of what you are growing in your garden so that you can rotate your crops to help keep the soil healthy. You may want to plant during one growing season, you may want to plant beans or fava beans, and that will help to nourish your soil. And then the next time you grow in that area, it would be good to go ahead and grow a fruiting crop or a leaf crop or a root crop and rotate through those so that you're not building up a pest problem in the soil, a disease problem in the soil, and you're not stripping the soil repetitively of the major nutrients that each of those crops needs. So those are a few tips about where to plant. If you have questions at any point, remember, go ahead and comment those in, and we will try to address those questions through this webinar or an upcoming webinar as well. So now it's time to think about how much space you need. It's important at the beginning to think about how much space you have, but it's also important in the planning process to think about how much space you actually need for each vegetable. Different vegetables grow to different sizes. Now, the fall gardening guide that I mentioned from AgriLife Extension gives you some detailed information about spacing needs. The seed packets also give you information about how far apart to space your plants. These are all very helpful suggestions. Some of our new home gardeners also like to use the square foot gardening method, and so we have included in our handouts a square foot gardening guide for you. On the back of that, there is actually a printed set of squares that you can cut out yourself if you would like to. This is a great family project. If you're planning your garden at home, you can have your children or you can do this yourself. Go ahead and cut those pieces out and you can actually paste them right onto your squares that you've made, or you can draw them by hand. Just another resource and way to keep this enjoyable. Square foot gardening tends to put the plants closer together than the recommendations mentioned. So if you choose to use this model, just make sure that you're prepared to adequate water and adequate food throughout the growth of those plants so that their nourishment can be supported. So we're going to go ahead and start on our design now to make sure that we have our full list. I have my partial list. I'm probably going to decide to add a few more things as we go through there, but I need to decide what I'm going to plant from seed and what I'm going to plant from plants or transplants. Now, typically, the way to think through this is if it's a large seed, if it's a pea or a melon or a pumpkin or a fava bean, those are all really large seeds and they typically planted directly into your garden soil. If you are growing something from a very small seed, you could start it indoors, something like a lettuce. Now, root crops typically do better if they're direct seeded, even though those carrot seeds are the radish seeds are very tiny. Go ahead and direct seed those because the root crops do better when they go straight in the ground. So if you're working with transplants during the summer months, you're preparing for your fall garden, you have your list. You might think through, okay, which of these plants could I start inside when it's hot, and then when it's September, October, November, I'll have a large plant, I'll get a head start on the growing season. I can go ahead and I can start them now and transplant them later. So of these, does well as a transplant. I know collards are going to do well as a transplant. I'm also going to like some lettuce in my garden. So that's another one that does well as a transplant. Now, I love beets. So my beets and my carrots, beets do fairly well transplanted, so that is an option for you. I typically just start them straight in the garden. They do very well that way. So my beets, my radishes, my carrots, I'm going to direct seed those. My peas, going to direct seed as well. So now that we have our list of what we're transplanting and what we are using direct seed, we can go ahead and start drawing out our plan. So this is the size of my garden. Forgive the fact that it's not actually square and some of the lines aren't straight. Our garden plans don't have to be perfect. It's okay for you to draw them to your level of perfection needs. Make them as beautiful as you want, keep them in a journal and compare them year to year. Post them online on digital media, we'd love to see them. Or you can just keep it for yourself and it helps you plan one season and then you throw it away, whatever your needs are. So a 4 foot by 4 foot garden is a fairly good size for a family to start with. If you are brand new to gardening, it's a great idea to start small. Start a little bit smaller than you want to, because that will make sure that you have the energy and the time and the resources to be successful with a small garden first, and then you can always expand it later. Start with whatever size you feel is reasonable for you. Now, your plan may look different from mine. Your plan may just be a single circle because all you're going to start with is one pot. If this is your plan, that's wonderful. Go ahead and draw your circle and decide what you're going to put in it. Maybe you're going to do lettuce and radishes. And that may be your plan. This is a great job. You've planned your garden. If you're doing something a little bit larger, go ahead and think through which plants are going to go in which sections. For the sake of convenience and ease in planning and showing you how to do this plan, I'm using the square foot garden planning method so that we can plug in how many plants to each section. So I know that broccoli under that method is going to need a square for each plant. I know that I can get, and I'm just gonna go ahead and put one. Now, again, if you want to draw these out, have fun. Make yourself a magnet board and have some beautiful colored magnets that you reuse year after year. Make this as interesting for yourself as you can. Then I'm gonna put in some radishes. Now, you can put up to 16 radishes in a square. I usually, when I plant, I fall somewhere between the two methods. I fall somewhere between AgriLife and square foot gardening. I like to give them a little more space than square foot gardening, but I tend to plant them a little bit closer than AgriLife. So these are, you're going to find the way that works best for you and how you garden, and that's okay. Then we're going to do our lettuce. Lettuce is going to take 4 plants. Now, the reason that we like to go ahead and plug in how many plants is because that's going to inform how many plants we need to start inside from seed or how many seeds we need to buy. A package holds a lot of seeds. If you are starting a Tarrant Area Food Bank does give out seeds to help you get started with that. We also accept donations of seeds. So if you are a nursery and you would like to give, we can help those find homes at community gardens. So please feel free to let us know, comment in if that's a need for you. If you are needing seeds to get started, we'll be happy to help with that. Lettuce, radishes, broccoli. Now I want collard greens. Collard green plants do get large, so I'm going to go ahead and plant on one. Now at the Tarrant Area Food Bank Learning Garden, we typically start all of our plants from seed indoors and then transplant them outside. It is also okay to buy these at a nursery. If you don't feel like you're ready for the seed starting process indoors, that's okay. If you do buy them from a nursery, if you're using SNAP benefits, remember that food crops can be paid for with your SNAP benefits. That's a wonderful resource, so we hope you'll take advantage of that if that's something that you do use. Okay, I have my collard greens. Now, I'd also like to grow some peas. We can do about 8 peas to a square foot. And I'm just going to make a few little dashes there to remind me that I need to put up a trellis for those peas to grow on. Now, trellising is a great way to use your vertical space. If you let things sprawl out on the ground, they take a lot more room. So if you're growing something like squash, melons, if you're putting in pumpkins, if you're growing tomatoes, these are all crops that like to vine out. Go ahead and put a trellis up and they'll grow up. And that way you have more of your soil area available to put in other crops. Okay, I still have a little bit of space left. So I'm gonna go ahead and put in my carrots. Now again, we could put 16 carrots based on the square foot gardening plan. I tend to do a little bit less than that, but make yourself happy with that as long as you're working to keep them growing. And then I'm gonna plug in my beets. Usually we don't do more than 9 beets to a square foot. We really like beets. So I'm gonna go ahead and put in 3 squares of that. And then the last thing that I want to add to my list is chard. This is a wonderful plant. We enjoy it, and it in our area, sometimes we can even keep it growing all through summer and all through winter. We get 2 years worth of growth off of one plant. So that's a fun one to try. And we have 4 plants going in there. So now we have our garden plan, and it's as simple as that. I usually like to label my plans. If I'm planning at home, this might be on a piece of paper. If I'm planning for something like the Tarrant Area Food Bank Learning Garden, typically I use a software program on that so that I can save it online to our computer, and we can record that, we can keep that from year to year. Do whatever feels most natural for you. But it is a good idea to date them so that you can remember what you grew the year before, and that makes it easier for you to do crop rotation and keep your soil healthy from year to year. Now, one thing we did not talk about in this process is how to actually put them in the ground, how to plant them. We will likely be doing more webinars throughout this time when we can't be in person with you. But I do want to show really quickly how to remove a plant from a pot so that if you decide to do transplants, you know how to take this out of the pot safely. Now, many of you have gardened for years, and this is not new to you. This is for the brand new gardener. We want to make sure we don't ever pull on the stem. So we're just going to put the stem in between our fingers and turn it upside down, squeeze the pot, and that's going to help release the soil from the pot. And then you're ready to plant it in the garden. We want to make sure we don't ever just yank on the stem because that can break your plant and that makes it hard for it to grow. So here's our garden plan for this year. If there are any questions, please feel free to comment them in. We'll get back to you with them if we don't have time to answer them in the webinar. We do have the container gardening workshop coming up next week. We hope you'll register for that on Zoom or on Eventbrite. Those are both options for registration for that one. Any questions coming through? So we are ready to wrap up for the day. I hope y'all have a wonderful planting season. I did promise you that we would talk a little bit about what's growing now, and I forgot. So let me tell you what you can still plant if you are ready to put something in the ground this weekend. We're a little bit late, but you could still get okra in. If you have large transplants of eggplant and pepper, you could go ahead and put those in as well. If you find transplants of cucumber that have already started, it's not going to be helpful to germinate those in the soil as much right now. But if you have a transplant of that, melon, pumpkin, you could still get those in the ground at this point. And southern peas like black-eyed peas are also doing really well. So I hope you have a wonderful time gardening.
We did get one question.
Oh, okay, great. We have a question.
Chuck asked, with square foot gardening, how often do you fertilize?
That's a great question. The square foot gardening method, if you actually go to their website, what they like to do is start with very, very built up soil. So they add all the nutrients at the So you usually don't have to, if you're following the full model, you usually don't have to add a lot of fertilizer through the process because you've at the beginning. And then you may have to nourish one more time or two more times throughout the growing season. Feeding them extra is going to happen if you are using the square foot garden spacing, but have not done the initial preparation to add in all of those nutrients at the beginning. A good rule of thumb when you're a natural slow release fertilizer is to add in a tablespoon. Now always read the package directions, right? Because I'm speaking generally and you're going to find specific products. So always read the directions on any fertilizer that you're using. If you're using organic slow release fertilizer that is not a high dosage of nitrogen, putting in about a tablespoon every 2 to 3 weeks for each plant tends to be enough to sustain growth. And we always want to prepare the soil at the beginning with the nutrients. I would highly recommend AgriLife Extension's guide for details about how to prepare your soil. That's a started, and there are some good resources for production as well. And how often to water a 4x? This is a great question. Now in the fall it's going to be different than in the spring and summer because Texas summers are very hot. The general rule of thumb is that plants need 1 inch of water either from rain or irrigation during the week. And that helps to sustain their growth. Now, Texas summers are hot. What we find is that 1 inch recommendation works really, really well for our lower temperatures. So in the fall, that's a perfect rule of thumb. When temperatures are reaching 90 and 100 degrees, I find that for vegetable gardening, you do need to have more than 1 inch of water per week because you want the water to absorb into the plants in a way that helps them do fruit production and healthy leaf production. So I like the rule of thumb that you add a 1/2 inch for every 10 degrees above 60 degrees during the week. That's a calculation that I have found helpful. Now, again, 1 inch is going to be the recommendation that you're going to hear most commonly. That's just personal experience that I find helps with that. So do plan to have your water nearby, be ready to go. I also suggest heavy mulch, making sure your soil is covered with heavy mulch. We love to use straw as mulch in the Tarrant Area Food Bank Learning Garden. There are a lot of other great mulching options. Having a thick layer of mulch is going to help reserve your water in your soil to make sure that it's available for your plants to use. We don't want to pour water and pour water and pour water onto our plants just for it to evaporate into the sky, right? We want the water to go to the root zone of our plants. That's efficient and it helps to reserve the water that is so important for our area. It's very critical that we be responsible with our water usage in addition to growing healthy food for our families. Absolutely. We had a question about repeating the water need. So 1 inch is the recommended amount of water. And now 1 inch means the water needs to soak into the soil 1 inch. So when you're watering the ground and you feel like you've put enough water on it, scratch down into the soil and you can tell if the water has actually soaked down 1 inch. So you need to see that that water has gone down 1 inch so that it's not just evaporating back into the sky and unavailable to the root usage. My personal for hot summer, I have another question coming in, so I hope you'll excuse me as I look away a little bit. For the really hot part of the summers, personally, I have found that our vegetables do better when we have an extra ½ inch for every 10 degrees above 60 degrees during the weekly average. Soaker hoses are a great resource so that you can really deeply water. Drip irrigation is one of my personal favorites so that it gets straight to the water, to the root zone. If you are using soaker hoses or drip irrigation, I prefer to cover those with the mulch so that, again, you're making sure your water gets directly to the root zone and doesn't evaporate up into the sky. I would also recommend Water University in our area is a wonderful AgriLife partnership. So Water University is a great resource. We have a lot of water questions, which is fantastic. That's a great resource for you to find out more about irrigation and how to make sure that the plants are actually absorbing all of the water that you give them and that we're being responsible about our water usage. Rainwater harvesting is probably another question that's going to come up as you start thinking about that. So definitely check out some of the virtual classes that they're offering for some of your water questions. And we may do a question about irrigation or a webinar later. If you have a webinar that you would really like to see us do about gardening, please feel free to comment that in. That helps to inform the classes that we are creating as well. Any other questions? Thank you all for joining us. We hope that you'll come back, continue commenting, continue asking questions. Please feel free to check out tafb.org for any upcoming events and webinars and to know how you can help in our area. Thank you so much. Have a great garden season.